Okay, good morning. My name, for those who don't know me, is Denis Hogan. I'm the UK Country Manager and Regional Manager for the Western Hemisphere for LEEA. It's great to be back in Aberdeen again. It's a couple of years since we were last here. And on our roadshows, they've grown over the years since we first started. I think the first event had about 25 people, if we were lucky. And that included the LEEA staff as well. And here we have got over 100 people gathered together. And one of the things we like to do on the roadshow is to provide subjects that are topical. The last time I was up here, we were talking about documentation, certification that comes with goods being placed in the market and reports of thorough examination. We're still actually continuing with those presentations, but we thought we'd try and find something that was a little bit more apt for the Aberdeen market. And what we came up with is a discussion about BS 7072. I'm not going to make a big presentation here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to set the scene and I'm going to lob a grenade into the crowd and see what happens. It's a very contentious point, an issue, and it's something that I believe personally, and I think LEEA believes as a body, that it needs to be addressed. So, the title is Withdrawal of BS 7072 Containers. Where do we go from here? So, what is a container? Those are a couple of examples. I'm sure for those of you in the room who've never seen them before, they're pretty standard things for various applications, but they're essentially a safe way of moving things from onshore to offshore and offshore to onshore again. And they're supposed to be specially designed for repeated use, and they have to comply with certain codes, the IMDG code, sections 12 and 13 in particular. But the history of it started in 1972 with the publication of a recommendation and harmonising interpretation and implementation of the International Convention for Safe Containers. But nothing happened for quite some time. And in fact, it wasn't until September in 1989 that 7072 was actually brought into being as a British standard. But look at its title. The title is Code of Practice for the Inspection and Repair of Offshore Containers. Where's the design? Well, the design is built into Annex A, and it's just a very, very basic use of ratios of 6:1 for strength factor, but it doesn't really dictate what the actual design of that container should be. And I think that the market recognised it worldwide that, yeah, it's a good starting point. And the way that you've proved that they're safe to use is that you test them. So every unit that's made had to be tested before it was placed on the market. But as they were working on a replacement for 7072 in May 1998, they actually published some guidelines, which those of you familiar with containers will know all about. MSC Circular 860. And it talked about the approval of containers, including the design. But it talked now about pre-slinging the containers with lifting sets and permanently attached to the container. So, work was already apace, and in October 1999, EN 12079 was published as a single document, specifically to supersede BS 7072, and it was withdrawn in 1999. This standard now took care of the fact that sling sets had to be permanently attached. Emphasis also was placed on the use of certain materials, methods of manufacture, and type testing of containers rather than individual testing, I beg your pardon. So no longer did you have to test every single container, it was all built into the design concept. But there was another move to actually increase the strength and stability of these by publishing new parts of 12079. And in February 2005, MGN 282 was published, which gave further guidance in the carriage of packaged dangerous goods to onshore, offshore supply vessels. But Section 7 was the doozy. That was the one that's why I'm here today now talking to you. Because it talked about saying that CTUs that do not fully comply with MSC Circ 860 built to BS 7072 may continue to be used subject to them being maintained and surveyed in accordance with the recognised standard until the 1st of January 2015. What's the date today? It's gone past the 1st of January 2015, and there's lots of containers out there to 7072. I haven't lobbed the grenade yet, but I'm about to. June 2006, 12079 was republished in 3 distinct parts. Parts 1 and 3 replacing the original single document published in 1999. But now there's a new part of the standard which is dedicated for the design, manufacture and marking of lifting sets. So we've now got a pretty comprehensive standard covering the design, manufacture and marking, design of lifting sets and periodic inspection and testing. So we've got a more complete standard. But a couple of years after that, they decided that, well, it's okay to keep this within Europe, but what about the rest of the world? And anybody who's been involved in the American market will know that it's a little bit of a subject that nobody wants to talk about. You know, what standards do they use? So 2008, work started on ISO 10855, Part 1, Part 2, Part 3. And you'll see that it's not a mistake, it's not an error, it's designed to be the same as 12079. It's following that as a model. So, just to recap, BS 7072 containers were built to withstand the test. They had to pass the proof load test before they could be placed into the marketplace. And it could be questioned, they're designed to pass the test and not to survive the reality of the harsh world out there offshore. On the other hand, BS 12079, they're designed to meet specific, essential health and safety requirements for safety, and emphasis being placed on the materials used, the assembly, the welding, the type testing, etc., and they're built with safety in mind, not just to pass a test. And going back now, harping to the statement that was contained in MGN 282, 1st of January 2015 was the deadline for when BS 7072 containers may no longer be used for the transport of dangerous goods. I'm emphasising that now, the transport of dangerous goods. So there is a lobby out there which says, well, that's okay, dangerous goods, but what about everything else? Surely we can carry on using them. Well, yeah, maybe. Maybe you can. Morally, is that right? That's the question I'm asking. So if 7072 was a valid design and still is a valid design, why are they not developing the ISO standard based on that? And I think, and it could be argued that the reason is that intrinsically they're less safe than a container that's made to EN 12079. By the way, I haven't mentioned DIN 2.7-1 because they are identical. I didn't want to particularly draw that into the argument, but they are the same standards. 12079, 2.71, essentially the same. So, now it's well past the 1st of January. Bear in mind the moral, all the above, the moral question is, should we still be using offshore containers made to a standard that was superseded 15 years ago? What have you got to say about that? So I'm throwing it open now. Any questions? Please, you're Lloyd's Register, yes?
Yes, Lloyd's Register. So
there's a microphone coming.
I don't need a microphone. I should explain, I've not been in the oil and gas industry for less than 8 years, so my experience is in other industries. The question of the Old British Standard is it still safe to use? So my question back to you and the folk on the floor here who've been in the industry longer than I, what's the failure rate on the Old British Standards? How many of these things actually fail in service?
I don't know the answer to that, but I'm sure there are people in this room who've got experience.
So the reason I'm asking it is, you're saying, are they still safe to use? Well, if they're not safe to use, and they've been using these things for 20 to 30 years, you really should know about it by now. And if you're basing your decision on fact, that is, have they been failing? the answer questions asked for answered already for you. If they've been failing, you shouldn't be using them at all today. Stop. If they haven't been failing, then why are you changing?
Very good question. Would anybody else like to take that point up?
I think the answer regarding your failures, as Dennis says, the forums we sit on, the meetings we attend, are very, very few and far between actually. Why they decided to change? Really no idea. But what I can say is there's a greater being above this. We may all want to and can use 7072 containers, but once they get dockside, I can assure you we're in trouble, because the dockers will refuse to load them. That's where the problem. And I wouldn't ask the question, Dennis, south of the border, is that still the case? And I know that we're governed by the same set of rules, but I'll be more stringent up here than they are over
I don't have any figures, Kenny, but I've been assured that they're equally vigilant in ports such as Yarmouth and those areas down there in terms of allowing 7072 units going offshore with dangerous goods in them. I mean, there is this strong argument about, well, they've got to be good for everything else. But don't forget that the MGM note that was put out was specifically about the movement of dangerous goods. And the line was drawn in the sand before that, when 860 was first published. They were looking for guidelines for, like at the time we were going through the period of the machinery directives within Europe, trying to build in essential health and safety requirements into products. For example, BS 1290 was the standard for making wire rope slings, which required, whether people did it or not is another matter, but it did require that every sling made was proof load tested to twice the working load limit. The same was true with 7072. Every container should have been proof load tested before it's placed on the market. But there was a great movement to say, well, let's not do this by testing, let's build quality in by making sure that the materials that are used to make a sling or the materials used to make a container and the way that it's put together and assembled by competent people means that you don't have to do the testing. We know that it's safe from the moment that it leaves that drawing board and it's assembled and it's type tested. We know that that's safe to use. So you can carry on making it to that pattern without doing an extensive amount of testing. I don't believe, by the way, that 7072 are unsafe, but they are intrinsically, I believe, less safe than the equivalent container made to the more modern standards. And going into the world market with 10855 going to be published, we think, within the next 3 or 4 years, that gives a platform for the world. Now, some people might say, well, it's okay, we'll just get rid of all 7072, send them abroad. But it's going to affect that market ultimately, because I think this will go worldwide. And the question is that, given that, and is it a question of money, by the way? Is it simply that 7072 containers are a lot cheaper to buy than the equivalent 12079? I'm sure that's got something to do with it. I'm certain it has. I mean, the fact that you can still order and purchase a container made to BS 7072 15 years after it was superseded is, to me, not the way that the industry needs to go. But, sorry, I don't want to be posing the questions. Sir?
I don't think, Richard said EMM, I don't think it's one of the containers being unsafe. I think it's one of lack of control on the design is where it is nowadays, or where it was then. Having been at this a very long time, I've seen some horrendous containers, but they met the standard. You also missed out one of the stages. There used to be up here Ofcon code as well, which basically got rid of fiberglass containers and things like that, and started actually using metal for a lot of them. But this D&D 12079 containers, etc. Well done. Definitely, I've moved everything on to, and I would say, to a safer place. Huge costs and all the rest of it involved in getting to that point. And the decision-making process from going from 7072 to 12079 has had a big impact, but you can't, I don't think you can really measure that in the number of incidents that's happened with containers falling apart. I think really early days, yes, there was things falling out, baskets all over the place, shooting out the side, and that was a bad design. The 7072 did give the industry a standard that met a level at the time, but there was no regulation and control on the building of them, and that's where the weak and the unsafe comes into it then. Not so much what they've all been using, it worked for 20 years, brilliant. And you will still see 7072 units needed in the marketplace now. But that's a decision between the receiver, the shipping, and the actual owner of it, how they agree to ship that forward. My own company, just last week or so, recertified a very special big basket, because it's the only one that exists. They need to still keep it and use it. And we went through the whole routine of doing the 2 yearly tests of 7072, NPI, and all the rest of it. And it's fine. It'll probably carry on the next 20 years doing this job quite adequately. I think the point is one of 7072 had no controls. Anybody could go with it, and there's horrendous units out there, plated in, pad eyes on top of ISO containers and things exist in the marketplace with very big brand names out there. So I don't know. It's a better place now, without a doubt.
Yeah, thank you very much. That's an interesting point you made. I didn't deliberately miss Ofcon out, and of course that was a lot ruled by SI 1019, wasn't it, as well? It was an important step, and it brought levity into the offshore. Yeah. There's some interesting points there. I mean, there's always more than one way to skin the rabbit, that's for sure. 12079 gives you the basic guidelines for the design of any container. Containers come in all sorts of shapes and sizes to suit different, movement of different types of equipment offshore. So there's always going to be a certain element of bespoke design in terms of what needs to be moved. But what rules should you be applying to the design of that? And I believe it has to be to 12079 and not to 7072, because 7072 only talks about strength factors. It doesn't talk about materials specifically. It doesn't talk about coded wells. It doesn't talk about the structural elements and so on and so forth that 12079 does. But anybody got any other comments to make? Yes, I'm glad that you're going to speak, Martin. Martin Robertson works for Swire.
Yeah.
And you've got a fair number of containers in your fleet.
Yeah, basically, going back 2 years ago, you were probably looking at about 45% of our fleet was 7072, and we've taken big steps to try and pull them all out of service when they come back and needed an overhaul being taken out. We're sitting at probably about 5% of our fleet just now, but it's still 7072, and as Kenny says, we're having problems at dockside. It's all about educating. If there is something that needs a specific lift, and we haven't got say 1207 container, but we haven't got a 7072 container, we've got to educate the people to know that, okay, this is what you can and can't put into it. As for going back to anything new build, absolutely the 7072 standard is not something we're looking to build new ones of. And we think probably 2 years now, on from now, all our 7072 containers will be gone, and our whole fleet will be 079.
That's interesting. So, that's a policy that Swire has specifically followed.
Yeah, it's obviously driven by
the writing's on the wall,
yeah,
the 7072.
Exactly.
It's just the way it is up here. You wouldn't
Yeah.
expect to build anything other than, and actually everybody's going to make sure it's DB 271 rather than anything else, because that's deemed as being the one slightly above. But I know there's a lot of parity between the two, but globally they're looking at the DB 271 sort of specification for it all. And that's normal, isn't it?
And I think for us to just taken every single 7072 container and replaced it with a new DMV or government, it would have been horrendous for that cost. We've had to stage it in. It's been a painful process for us, but we know that the industry that's what we'll have to do. But there are still some there that we do.
To me, I think that hearing that from a company like Swire, who are probably, if not the leading, player in the game, they're certainly up there, to hear that Swire are taking positive steps to eventually get them out of the fleet. You've gone from 45% how many years ago? 4 years ago to roughly 5% now. That seems to me to be headed in the right direction.
And it was easier in other locations around the world because they were new locations for us.
Yeah.
So they were getting a new fleet. And as some people say, no, just put all the 772 overseas. That was never going to happen. We built a new 1279 container for the overseas bases. So it's really only the UK that have still got the 772.
What was it? 1279s or 271s for your overseas?
Well, they're dual.
Yeah, I know,
It's
but
kind of-
it's-
well,
was it
well,
a
it's-
specification
It's Lloyd's,
say?
it's Lloyd's that we get for our
That's the one which go on.
So yes, 1279.
Yeah.
Yeah. Interesting point about 2.7-1. That was recently updated. And the reason why 12079 was not updated was to keep it in line with the ISO standard, because when ISO 10855 is published, it will be published as BS-EN ISO 10855 and will supersede 12079. And that's the reason why they've not upgraded. So there may be some very slight differences if you look at 12079 parts 1, 2 and 3 and compare them directly to 2.7-1. They are different slightly, but that will be reflected when the ISO standard is published.
We also came across a standard, I think, Craig, the China guy, he's never heard of it before, it's the AS 1279.
AS 12079. Are they upside down? You get it everywhere. I mean, in Brazil, they're notorious for taking the European standards and giving it their own twist, publicising it in both dual English and Portuguese. But essentially, they stick with the basic requirements. The exception I did see recently was that in the equivalent of 13414, which is for lifting sets, they have allowed, like the ASME B30.9, to have a master link with all 4 links going into there. Now, clearly that is unacceptable when it comes to container lifting sets. They have to go into a sub-assembly, a quad link. But you're right, I mean, people will copy the British standards and the European standards worldwide, because why reinvent the wheel? I would love to see the situation where really all standards for materials and for slings and for shackles, etc., were just simply an ISO standard. Because a shackle is a shackle is a shackle. They should be the same wherever they're made. That's my personal opinion. But I don't want to let personal opinions come into it. Anybody else like to make any other comments? No, is that it? Okay. Well, thank you very much for listening to my drivel. We're available now, obviously, you know, if anybody wants to come and talk to me about this subject or any other matter related to lifting equipment, please feel free to come and tell me. Thank you very much indeed.
What is, sorry, what is LEEA's view on it?
Beg your pardon?
Are you sitting on the fence on this, or are you going to give a view on it?
LEEA have to take the opinion that if a standard has been withdrawn and there are rules that have been put in place, then those rules should be followed. And certainly in terms of the movement of dangerous goods, LEEA's opinion is that they should not be used anymore. 7072 containers should not be used for the movement of dangerous goods. We also believe that when a standard is superseded, that it should be really taken out of service. However, you know, BS 3032, that's been superseded, and yet still we get shackles made to that. It's very difficult. You have to go with the market. But by the same token, what Ben Dobbs, our technical manager, is doing, he's amassing a dossier of information, excuse me, related to where standards have been published and nobody's making them to that standard. I'll give you a great example. Thimbles for a humble wire rope, they should be made in accordance with EN 13411 Part 1. You cannot get a manufacturer to make them to that. The best you'll get is BS 463. That's all you're going to get, really. And, you know, is there anything better about one made to 13411 Part 1 than BS 463? Well, the answer is we don't know, because nobody makes them to that. Why on earth do they publish a standard that nobody's going to work to?
You're quoting dangerous goods. What would you classify as dangerous goods?
I would refer you to the IMDG for that, because I'm not sufficiently knowledgeable enough to know what is a dangerous good and what's not, other than what's in the code that's produced by IMDG. But if it's just a container full of wire rope slings and shackles, in other words, a rigging loft, I wouldn't constitute that as dangerous goods. But if you've got chemicals in there which come under the IMDG codes, then they are dangerous goods, and you can't put them in a 7072 container. No, LEEA don't want to sit on the fence, but we also want to listen to what our members say and take that and feed it back to the powers that be. And we've become, increasingly more efficient at listening to what our members say and taking it back to those who can make a decision about it. Whether the move that was made in 2005 to effectively oust 7072 containers as from the 1st of January 2015, was that a right decision? And I guess that's why the subject's been raised today, to get a feedback from the membership. And okay, we're not representing the whole of industry here, with the offshore industry in Aberdeen. Maybe we could have enticed a few more people who are, dealing with containers on a day-to-day basis from a user perspective, and manufacturers alike, and inspection organisations. But what we can do is to gauge public opinion and take that opinion and feed it back to the people who put it out there in the first instance. LEEA, I think, if I'm honest, when I was working for Bryden and Certex back in the sort of mid-90s, I think LEEA used to sit on the fence. They'd play devil's advocate and give you 3 or 4 arguments but never give you an answer. I would like to think that we have changed. We've got more guts now to come out and say, well, this is the situation, but we're also quite inclined to say, but I see your point of view. Tell me what you think about it, and I'll feed it back in. Is that true, Jeff? I think so. Yeah. Members, is that true? Do you see a new face of LEEA? Are we different than we used to be? Are we more self-effacing and listening to criticism and taking that criticism, doing something about it? That's what we're trying to do. I'll get off my soapbox now.